I hadn't thought myself a philosopher when I first thought myself a writer. In fact, I originally wanted to be a poet. However, my poetry lacked originality. Thus, none of it appears in this book. I strayed from considering myself a storyteller because each story I ever wrote came as opposed to anything I consciously strove for to be like a spontaneous dream that occurred via writing, as if I were a medium and could not account for on any grounds other than what I suppose my subconscious must have quietly steeped and brewed for a rainy day. I now think myself a philosopher because I love and devote myself to wisdom, or the attempt to ever cultivate and develop at least some sense of wisdom, which, though seems to differ between us all, is in the same light. Just why, at least in terms of its foundation, it is a matter of what we create. So, in retrospect, I find that my stories play out and simplify my philosophy I created. Thus, I've divided this book into two sections: the stories and the philosophizations, which I've entitled words. The stories, I believe, require less explanation than my philosophy. However, of the stories, a couple of things. There is no consistent style in the fashion that much literature is often written. For example, romanticism, realism, modernism, postmodernism, etc. And further on that note, there is certainly no attempt here at writing particularly realistic or even subtle dialogue, since I think subtlety is at best a tool or device, not a literary religion. Also, unlike my philosophy, which is ever developing, as I mentioned earlier, the stories were written in particular points in time, some of which I ironically don't recall. Thus, there is nothing chronological, consciously speaking, about the order of the stories. However, I began writing them at 18, when I was 18 in 2004, in Ostero, Florida, where amidst a lot of swampland and conservative Christianity, I wrote Backwards Love Story poem. The stories to Unison and Devin Renaud were written in San Diego County, California, during the summer of 2009, and everything else was written somewhere, sometime in New Jersey, central New Jersey, between 2004 and 2009. Though my philosophy is ever developing, ever cultivating, it does lay upon some foundation, such as ideas of foundation, ever developing, ever cultivating, in themselves. However, by virtue of such ideas, it is, speaking of it basely, might I add, more so thinking, theorizing, philosophizing, etc., as opposed to expounding a theory. You will find no essays in here. This is why I use the word philosophizations. In the first place, there is no name for any kind of theory I have. Words is simply the best title for what I consider to be the first chapter or phase in the creation of my philosophy, if for no other reason because its very conception begins with words in themselves. However, unlike most previous philosophers, I sought not to write about words in themselves, not to write about words in themselves, but rather to conceive, perception. Perceive via thinking, and thinking in itself, via solely connecting words to each other. Perhaps like an astronomer draws constellations by connecting stars to each other, or a scientist draws tendencies by connecting consistencies they observe and test, or a musician draws harmony via connecting sounds or musical notes. Much occurs while connecting words to each other. Something quite holographic in the illustration and manifestation of multidimensionalism, or ever-growing ways to perceive the order of words. Something quite karmic in the substance of words and how they affect each other, the way elements, compounds, and chemicals have effects. And something quite creative in the free will, where we choose the words we use. Regarding the format or structure of words, it is simply thinking, Joyce-like stream of consciousness, in a sense, though more progressively and more particularly philosophizing. That's why I call my writings philosophizations. However, they are with words as the sole medium, the sole source of the construction, development, cultivation, creation, etc. Quite similar to what Bertrand Russell did with philosophy using mathematics. Some other things of key importance regarding words. Certain metaphysical assumptions which every philosophy, even Nietzsche's, though he thinks he's a nihilist and an immoralist, which he's not, is subject to, which brings me to one of my greatest sources of inspiration and influence, Friedrich Nietzsche, who assumes a couple of great and very important things. That is, nothing is absolute. Thus we create our own philosophies, and that we instinctively do so via what he refers to as the will to power, or what some call the law of attraction, or you might use the expression karma. That our thoughts and feelings create our philosophy. Or really, to say in even less words, Nietzsche brought about existentialism and postmodernism. What he wished to create was the transvaluation of values. Unfortunately, he died before having the opportunity. I do not believe any philosopher has taken up Nietzsche's great challenge to create a philosophy which surpasses absolutism to a point of an ever-expanding universe of unlimited possibility and complete interconnectivity. Thus, as a process, one which transforms his nihilism not solely into an immoral and refutable philosophy, but into a tool in itself, a kind of way to reject any logic or idea which stunts one's creativity, which blunts the eyes from that which seems to be outside the box. Thus all cynicism, pessimism, dogmatism, apathy, nihilism, as anything but a resource, are inevitably signs of ingratitude, ignorance, and depression. When we have the capacity to create joy for ourselves, believing and thinking whatever we choose, which of course is the very reason we ought to take very seriously our philosophies, our morals, our wandering thoughts and fantasies, and learn to control them, use them, and with them, in a sense, bless consciousness, subconsciousness, the universe, to whatever source or lack thereof which one attributes its creation to, and such blesses us.